So I'm playing Beethoven's Sonata No. 6 in F major, Opus 2, number 2 at the moment, and in this video I'm going to look at more practical aspects, i.e. how you would learn and practice and perhaps overcome some of the trickier parts, or at least parts that I found tricky in this movement. So the opening itself is not too difficult. It's an F major chord. But these little bits, I think they're not that difficult, but I think they do touch on a theme that's relevant throughout the work, and particularly in the style of music. I've been playing a lot of Brahms at the moment, and Rachmaninoff and sort of romantic, later romantic music, and I've actually found it really difficult doing some of the more sort of fiddly finger work and trills and things like that in classical, in Beethoven and Mozart. And one of the things is that on the modern piano, this piano has a particularly difficult action. It's unlike the piano, if you've played on a forte piano from Beethoven's time or Mozart's time, it's much easier action. So it's possible to do all of that fancy finger trill, fioriture, whatever you like, with your fingers. Whereas it's really difficult with a piano like this. However, one doesn't have to use the fingers alone. And I was taught very much in the old-fashioned sort of finger school. Everything's done with fingers and basically just leads to injury and uneven playing and a loss of control. But that's certainly my experience of it. But with this kind of thing, the choreography of the wrist and the arm is so important because they can help you out. So with this kind of a thing, instead of just trying to do this, my fingers, really that's uneven and it doesn't feel good. I would do something like this. And so basically sort of a vertical movement and not fixing or locking the wrist and using the wrist to help, I suppose, guide the fingers. Then with this next bit, now, needs a nice legato in the right hand, and that's just something, to practice and to listen. And I would play that a few times over and evaluate each time I've done it and see if it's closer to what I want. The left hand is a little bit trickier. It's these chords. Now, it's possible in most of them to do a finger legato by holding onto one note, but there's one or two where you can't, where you're going to have to use the pedal. And also, I personally like, although I've heard many pianists do it differently, I personally like to have a little bit of the top line, particularly towards the end of the phrase. This. So one of the ways of practicing a chord passage like that is, it's a fantastic solution that I found from, actually given to me by Graham Fitch, and he uses it a lot in a lot of his teaching videos, is to tap some of the notes. So one way to do it would be to tap the top note. You can do it with or without pedal. I would say maybe do it without at first and then make sure you've got good legato pedaling as well. Yeah, that you can do the opposite. You can do the bottom two notes. Oh, that's quite difficult. And the same thing with the... Now, that trill is another example of that kind of choreography. Fixed finger just feels awful. Whereas almost preparing for it as if you were a string player bowing. And this up, down. Now, I'm mentioning those quite laboriously, those movements, and it's because they don't come naturally to me, because that's not how I was originally taught to play, but they are really essential. And I imagine that actually with a piano with a heavy action like this, a lot of people who have a similar, have been schooled a similar way to me would really struggle. Next bit is pretty much the same. And then this bit here. So the right right hand, the tapping works as well, actually, but it's also quite good to practice something like this, just separate fingers. So you put all of the fingers on the keys, and you do the other, and then the thumb. It seems odd that that works, but for some reason it really does. I think it gives a sense of, for want of a better word, independence or awareness of what each finger needs to do, and that becomes a subconscious thing. I've been amazed by how many, particularly octave passages, which have just felt a bit messy, where I've just practiced them with the, usually 5 and 1, 4 and 1, the top and the bottom fingers separately, and it works wonders. They just feel so much secure after that. This left hand, it's not too difficult. And then I would also, talking on the subject of choreography, is a sort of more of a wrist circle. It's a little bit more difficult there, when it changes. Now, that's a classic passage. These kind of semiquaver passages. It's a classic passage to practice in your traditional rhythms. Now that, you've got to be careful that that practice doesn't become mindless, and also it creates tension. The idea behind using rhythms is actually that the long beat is an opportunity to release tension. And I certainly did myself a lot of damage doing far too much mindless rhythm practice, where actually what I was doing was just building more and more tension, even though the whole idea is the opposite. You can do it the other way around as well. It sounds a bit funny. I do go on to the next note there because that's a bit of a tricky join, and I realized learning those passages separately and trying to put them together, it always botched that by bar 30 where it goes. And that's also a bit tricky because you're going from one beat in a bar kind of divided into 8, and then one beat in a bar with those sort of offbeat accents, and instead of 8 it's 12. And there's this the joyful 3 against 2s, which are sort of everyone's bugbear. But anyway, before I get on to that, another way to practice a semiquaver passage like this is not, so the rhythm, I was just doing short, long, or long, short. You could also do, that idea of sort of those little bits fast. I can already hear some of those bits weren't even, so it's a great way of working on things. It avoids you building tension because you've got a chance to stop. You're less likely to slip and hit wrong notes, so it's just much more effective. And also you're building the reflexes for fast playing. Slow practice is useful to a point, and then you need to up it a notch. And then another option, you could do different variations of that, and you could possibly have the long note in different places. It starts to get a bit much, but it's not a bad way of doing things. I think just if you do too many of those things, it's very easy for your mind to wander a bit, and then you stop doing them effectively. I think what's important is rather do fewer variations, or different variations on different days, but keep focusing. I say this like this is some great wisdom that I put into practice myself. It's not, it's actually the opposite. It's what I really realize I should be doing. And then rhythms, great. Accents, also useful. I find this actually quite difficult because I haven't really done very much of this. So one obvious one to do, well, one way to do it is to do accent every second beat and then remove the accents or change where the accents fall. So this would be... And then you can just do the first group, and this actually helps because you do kind of want that feeling of, I think it almost does feel like it's a bit 2 in a bar when you bleed into the bar 30. So I would do bit exaggerated, but I would want something like this. That works quite nicely. Then this next bit from bar 30 is, actually I had it when I first learnt it, and then I changed the fingering because I realized there was something just slightly uneven and awkward in the left hand, and everything went quickly southwards. And what it comes down again to, well, it's a combination of things. Firstly, rhythm. You really have to be able to get the feeling of going. One way to do that, to get the sextuplets right, is to do it 4 in a bar. Although it's not going to be, it's going to be 2 in a bar. So you do. And then you can do the. That's 4 against 6. It's actually 2 against 3. So it helps to get that feeling going, and making sure that that the third beat of the semiquavers lands on the 4th beat of the sextuplets. It's a fun coordination challenge there. But the coordination, so there's one thing about the counting and the rhythm and having the right feeling there. The other thing that's important is really just the technique of the left hand and having that really controlled. What I realized I was doing was falling back onto my finger habit. So this is where choreography also very, very important. So I was doing this. That's really, really difficult, and difficult to do at speed, and difficult to do after a while, because it creates tension and fatigue. So this is where Graham said to me once again, I did know that I could use a bit of a rotation for an Alberti bass. So I wasn't entirely rigid, but what I didn't realize is that I had fixed my wrist, and that actually there's also the vertical as opposed to lateral movement that is really, really helpful here. So what Graham suggested to do was to go down, up, down. And that up, down is effectively the subdivisions of the bar into 4s. And then, different ways of practicing this. Sorry, that was a bit of a mixture of a few. But firstly doing it separately. Just to get that rising and falling. Actually, that wasn't very good. And then you can do. It's a bit difficult with the 4 against 3, but basically different combinations with the right hand will help with that. So then definitely makes sense to practice from just the bar before and then this. And I should also just say that this is this habit, because I'm trying to count and stay in time there, of accenting the first beat, which one doesn't need to do. So I would practice that with a bit of exaggeration, do something like. Oh, I said exactly the wrong way. So just to exaggerate the louder note, make it louder, and the first beat in the bar less, and then obviously not doing that when playing, but I think I've discovered recently that exaggeration really does help as exaggeration as a practice tool. And then we have, that's quite tricky there. I would say coming off the last note of the song, because there isn't a phrase marking over there anywhere. Then this next bit. So firstly, the right hand, I would throw the hand. And another way of practicing it, because it's, I use more of the left hand to create the emphasis there. And the sforzando is actually in the left hand. And also I have had many problems with my right hand, so I don't really want to be having too much tension there. And also the fact that there's lots of notes, I think it'll be pretty dramatic enough. So. Another way of practicing this, I found that first two notes of each group of three of the demi-semiquavers in the right hand to be difficult. So I would go. And then actually playing them together as chords. It's quite a good way of practicing. Then this next bit. I found this really tricky. I don't know why, I find chord passages where the chords move quite quickly and shift. I think what's the term the Graham uses, chord streams. I find very tricky, and when they're staccato or not staccato here, but detached, is even more difficult. So there's a few ways of doing it. Now, technically, this is one of those things that I find quite interesting, in that if you ask, well-known teachers how to play chords like this, one of the schools of playing, which I think is very much very evident, one of the approaches which is very evident in the Russian school, is you pluck. That's quite, that's a really good way to learn the notes. You feel like there's a grip in them. Problem is, for somebody like me who's struggled with RSI and tennis elbow, that is a recipe for disaster. But it is still a very useful way to practice. The other approach is to use purely wrist action. Now, that has no tension, but it doesn't feel as controlled. And personally, and this is just my personal approach, I find it's one of those things where actually having a slight combination helps. It's one of those things where, like Bill Westley says, is it 60% wrist and 40% fingers and like 2% arm, or is it really? I don't know, but like I think that combining those two things means that I've got a bit of a sense of grip with the plucking, but I don't have to be too reliant on that, and I can reduce a bit of tension by cushioning with my wrist. Now, way of learning something like that, there's a whole lot of ways to practice this. Now, one would be to do exactly what I'd said earlier, to play selective. Oh. That's one way to build it up. Then, to get that wrist movement and to free up the wrist, this is quite useful. And then I found that works really, really well. Then combinations of different speeds, the fast-slow approach. That, I don't know if you could see from the overhead there, but I split a few notes there, so that immediately tells me where there's some distances that I don't quite know as well as, or placements that I don't quite know as well as I would like, and then. And then tapping can work as well. Just be careful with that one though, because that can be quite tiring. So that's those are ways of practicing that, and I would say that, okay, it's a bit rusty now, but that passage does not really, practicing it like that for a day or two, it doesn't bother me. It also comes back a bit later with this. It's the same thing there as well. I always find those kinds of passages where you've got something repeated in a different key with a few slight variations in terms of the notes and all of that to be a bit tricky. So I would do those back to back. Then we've got a classic little Alberti bass. That's classic case of rotation. And then this. Now those trills, I think that the secret with trills, particularly in classical era, is that you need to, you don't just throw yourself at them and hope that it works. So firstly, fingering, I do 2, 1. I alternate 2 and 1 on the G. And then 2, 3, 2, 3, 1. That worked quite well for me. I've got this edition has 3, 5. That actually doesn't feel too bad, but it's not one I would use. But yeah, you have to find a fingering that's comfortable and even. Then it needs to be measured out. So it's not quite going to be exact because of all of the different notes that are played, but I practice this quite a lot like this. And practicing that, basically having a fairly consistent idea of where each of the main notes of the trills coincides with not every left-hand note, but maybe the main ones. So, and I'm practicing like that. And actually, that's not so bad. I found that came quite quickly. It's not too bad. So that wraps up the exposition. And now I'm going to move on to the development.